Dean Elmore gave such a beautiful introduction that I think I'll just talk about his introduction. Since the title of today's talk is Yoga and Psychology and how to be a change within this world, Dean Elmore was telling us that he felt that we should live our dreams. Emerson had said that the truest life is when we live our dreams while we are awake. And that is not a matter of circumstances that happen within this world. It is how we respond and process the circumstances that happen in the world. The mind is such a thing that it can, as Emerson said, it could make hell into heaven or heaven into hell. Now, psychology, as it is studied in universities, is a great science to give stability and a deeper sense of real insight to the mind. From the perspective of yoga, it deals with the subject of psychology from another perspective. An example is given that if there is a disease of boils on the body, one way to treat it is to deal with the symptoms by putting ointments or compresses on the boils to actually cure them. But if there is a disease in the blood, no matter how many boils we cure, they're going to keep coming. So what is the deep underlying disease that causes anxiety and suffering within this world? The Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the great scriptures on which yoga is based, explains that this disease is avidya, or ignorance. Ignorance of who we really are and what we really want. One thing that every living being has in common is we are all seeking inner fulfillment. This is described in the Vedas, Anandamayo Bhyashat, that every living being is seeking pleasure. We have that in common. Whether one is a man or a woman, or whether one is black or white or red or yellow or brown, or whether one is a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew or a Jain or a Zoroastrian, or whether one's rich or poor or from the east or the west, whether one is a human or a dog or a cat or a cockroach. Do you ever have cockroaches in your house? Or a bed bug? In Boston, I heard there's a lot of bed bugs. Well, those bed bugs are after the same thing that you're after. Pleasure, right? You're going to school and going through a whole university process with the hope that you're going to find some pleasure in your life. Well, the bed bug is biting you in bed looking for pleasure. We are all seeking pleasure. It is our nature. Now, for us humans, we understand this. There's pleasure of the body, there's pleasure of the mind, And then there's pleasure of the heart. And the subtler we go, the deeper and the more profound impact that pleasure actually has on us. Let's just take the body and mind for example. If there's some pain in your body, it causes disturbance. Yes? Now let us say, if your mind is in a very peaceful, very optimistic, very hopeful, very satisfied state, even if there's a pain in the body, we feel it just like anybody else, but we're happy. But even if your body is in perfect condition, if your mind's in anxiety, can you be happy? So the power of the mind is much stronger than the power of the body to be able to either give us happiness or distress. One of my dearest friends, his name was Bhakti Tirtha Swami. Actually, this book I wrote, I'll tell you why I wrote the book, and then I'll get back to the psychology stuff. Bhakti Tirtha Swami was an African American who was born and raised in the ghettos of Cleveland, Ohio. And in those days, in the 1950s and 1960s, if you're African American, if you're born in the ghetto, it's 98% chance you're going to live and die in the ghetto. There was no real equal opportunities. In the Constitution and in the ideals of the country, there was. But in real life, there just wasn't. Dr. Martin Luther King, inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. There's a real connection between America and India. He went on a campaign to bring civil rights through nonviolence. A war where the weapon was faith and integrity, not guns and bombs. Wars against injustice. He told me when he was a young boy in school, every male carried a gun, loaded. Not a toy gun, a real gun. Otherwise, you can't survive. But he came out of that situation because he had hope. He had so much hope, he had so much optimism, and he had so much faith that there was a higher power that could bring him up. And eventually, he got a full scholarship to Princeton University. He did hard work, but it wasn't just his grades. It was his personality. He attracted people to want to help him. And he was a civil rights leader in Princeton University. And ultimately he graduated. And then he became a very, very deeply spiritual person in the same tradition as myself, the Vaishnava or Bhakti tradition of India. He wrote about 15 books, traveled all over the world, had many followers. Nelson Mandela, Muhammad Ali, Alice Coltrane would come to him for guidance. About 5 years ago, he called me. He was in his last stages of melanoma cancer. He said that he felt he only had three more days to live. I drove about 6 hours to rural Pennsylvania where he was. And we spent some time together. The next day, I remember I had to leave. I had lectures, I had meetings, and they were set up long in advance, and they were really, really serious. I just had to be there. So I went to his room to say goodbye to him, But before I could say a word, he said, "I want to die in your arms. Stay with me." I said, "I'm here. As long as you live, I'm here at your bedside." I canceled all my meetings. Anyways, he stayed around another 8 weeks. And those were some of the most meaningful days of my whole life. And I remember one day he was in his worst state as far as physical condition. The cancer, he had tumors all over his body, a leg was amputated, he was emaciated, and his whole body one day was just trembling due to pain. The cancer was just ravaging him. It would kind of go up and down. That was the worst point. And I was at his bedside. We put him up on a chair to sit, and I was trying to talk to him, and I could see he wasn't able to focus. So I started chanting these beautiful mantras of God's names. And suddenly, he smiled. It was not just like we see smiles. It was a supernatural smile. It was so big and so spontaneous. And from his eyes, I never saw him cry due to pain or anything else, but he was crying in ecstasy. And he started shaking his head. And he told me, "It doesn't get any better than this." And he said, "I would not trade my position for anyone else in the world, because I am tasting the sweetness of that inner love for God in my heart and God's love for me more than I've ever. I would not trade this position for anything else. I'm tasting the sweetness of God's love and God's name." Now that's really something beyond mind over matter. His physical condition and the pain didn't change, but he was accessing something so deep, so beautiful, and so wonderful that it made the physical condition just a detail in life. In fact, the physical condition helped him to access that. So to learn, to see the opportunity in every situation is a very important part of the psychology of yoga. To access who we really are and the joy that is within us. According to the Bhagavad Gita, there is the body, there is the mind, and there is the Atma, the living force. That living force is what's seeing. Who is seeing through the eyes and tasting through the tongue and hearing through the ears, thinking through the brain? Who am I? The Gita explains that living force is Satchit Ananda. Najayate mriyate vakadachit. Unborn and undying. It's eternal. And by its own inherent nature, it's full of happiness. And from the yoga perspective, the divine is so closely and so intimately connected because that living force is a part of the divine, a part of God. And this is a universal principle. In the Bible it is said, the first and great commandment is to love God with all your mind, all your words, with your whole heart, mind, and soul. And if one does that, then naturally we learn to love our neighbor as ourselves, because we see that eternal spark, that source of consciousness that is within us, that is a part of God. is the same in every living being. Wherever there's life, there is the presence of that sacred spiritual spark. So when we love God, when we know ourselves, we actually see every living being as our brothers and our sisters. We actually perceive the sacredness of life. In the 5th chapter of the Gita, there's a beautiful verse. Vidyavanaya sampane brahmanika vihastini sunichaiva swapakeja panditasamadarsana. Real wisdom is defined in this way: the ability to see every living being with equal vision. Not that we just see the equality on a social level, or to try to create, more social peace, because that could change. But to actually identify and love every living being by seeing wherever there's life, there is a sacred part of God. There is a deep and true relationship. When love of God awakens within the heart, the test of that is not what religion we follow and what rituals we perform or how loud we can speak on the campus green. The real test of love of God, which is universal, the essence, is how we are instruments of compassion to every living being, without prejudice, without judgment, to be an instrument of that compassion that is within us. That fulfillment that we are all looking for, from the cockroach to the Queen of England and everyone else in between. It's love. The most fundamental need for all living beings is to love and be loved. Nothing else can give satisfaction to the heart. And that love is our nature. It is within us. It is who we are. And it is our greatest potential. To access that love is the essential purpose of every great spiritual path. Why are we not experiencing it? Why are we so afraid of death when we're eternal? Why do we hate when our nature is to love? It's due to this avidya, or ignorance, the root cause of suffering and problems. We have forgotten who we are. The next question, why have we forgotten? Now we can speak from that subject from many different perspectives, but from a very practical level. It's because the mind is so full of dust. The mind is considered a mirror. We, the soul, are seeing life through the mind while we're living in this embodied form. Now, the purpose of the mind is to reflect who we really are. And actually be a medium the mind is a medium by which the grace and the love of our soul can manifest within the world for the welfare of all beings. But if the mirror is covered with layers and layers and layers of dust and dirt and debris, what do you see? The dust. And the dust in this sense is all of our attachments, all of our misconceptions, all of our aversions, all of our fears, all of our temptations, and essentially our ego. Our ahankar. But if we cleanse the mirror then we can actually see ourselves. The Bhagavad Gita tells that for one who learns to control and clean the mind is your very, very best friend. But for one who fails to do so, the mind is the greatest enemy. The Gita and the Bhagavad explains there's really no other enemies except our own mind. Booker T. Washington. He was a slave, emancipated slave. When he was about 9 years old, he was working hard labor. Prejudice, persecuted. But he was just so positive in his spirit. He came out to be a founder of an institution. He got scholarships and such tremendous impact he had in the world. There's one statement he made that really moved my heart. It's what we're talking about. He proclaimed, "I will not allow any man to belittle and degrade my soul by making me hate him." I'll repeat that. I will not allow any man to belittle my soul by making me hate him. He refused to hate, even though he was hated. His perception. He was seeing life from a different perspective. He was seeing life not as a reaction to what's happening outside of us. He was seeing life from a realization that he found within himself. Michelangelo, he was asked, "How do you carve these beautiful statues?" He said, "When I see a crude block of marble or stone," he said, "I see the finished product of the statue. From the very beginning, I see it right there. And then all I do is I just chip away those things that obscure it." Life is so much according to our perception, our vision. These are very practical, historical explanations of how people trained their mind. We've all heard the story about you can see the glass as being half empty or half full. You could complain that it's half empty, or you could rejoice that it's half full. It's the same thing. The reality is, in this world, we have a little bit of control over some things, but we really don't have much control over everything. I was recently talking to my father on the phone. He's 87 years old. I called him to wish him happy birthday on November 13th, just 3 days ago. He said, "I don't feel like I'm 87, but I'm 87. And he was talking, he wants to come to India in January. And he was saying how, if only I was younger, I would love to just come, so much. I love your people there so much. So old age is not within our control. We have to get old. Sometimes we have to get diseased. And sometimes people just don't treat us the way we want to be treated. And sometimes things just don't happen the way we want them to happen. There's some control we have, but ultimately we don't. The nature of the world is it's created in dualities, success and failure, honor and dishonor, pleasure and pain, happiness and distress, health and disease. And these dualities are like two sides of the same coin. You just can't take one without the other. They're going to happen. But one thing we do have control over is how we're going to interpret it and how we're going to respond to it. Are we going to respond to hatred with love? Or are we going to respond to hatred with hatred? Who was it? I think it was Nelson Mandela said that when you respond to hatred with hatred, what you do is you're drinking poison with the intent of killing the person you hate. Does that make sense? There's a Chinese proverb: if you want to get vengeance in someone, dig 2 graves. One for the person, one for you. Because you're killing your own inner substance, your own inner goodness, by polluting it with these things. So yoga, or real spirituality, teaches us the tools by which we actually learn how to control our mind on the basis of the real substance of who we are. There's a beautiful example in the Bhagavad Gita that the body is like a chariot and the 5 senses are like 5 horses, and the mind is like the reins, the ropes that are meant to control the horses, which determine the direction of the chariot. The intelligence is the chariot driver. And the Atma, or the eternal soul, the true self, the part of God, is the passenger. Now, if the intelligence is guiding the mind, which is guiding the senses and the body according to the will of the passenger, then we're going really in the right direction. But if the passenger is just at the whims of the uncontrolled senses and horses of the mind, then we're in a very, very difficult situation. So yoga is to harmonize the body, the mind, and the soul, so that they're all working for the same purpose. And this is the greatest need. Spirituality, religion, yoga is not about changing our faith. It's about changing our hearts. It's not about changing our occupation. It's about changing our motivations. It's about accessing the great wealth, the great treasure that is within us. But the mind is like a wild monkey. How many of you have been encountered by monkeys? Please raise your hand. Krishna, in the Gita, it explains, yato yato nishchalati manaschanchanamastaram. It means this mind is so unsteady and fickle and just roaming here and there and everywhere. I read a statistic that the mind has an average, for a human being, whoever you are, 60,000 separate thoughts every day. How many of you have ever tried to meditate? Well, you may have had this experience. You sit to meditate. You may have a mantra you're meditating on, or you may have some object of meditation, and then your mind starts going off. You start thinking about what somebody said about you yesterday. Or you start thinking about what I have to do tomorrow. Or you start thinking about the car you used to drive in 1965. Or you start thinking about the loss of a loved one. Or you start craving for the cookie that's on the kitchen counter waiting for you. And then suddenly you become aware that what happened to my meditation? It's the nature of the mind. The mind's like a monkey. And according to the yoga process, the best way to control the monkey of this mind is to give the monkey a higher engagement. When we experience, like my friend Bhakti Tirtha Swami, when we experience something higher, something deeper than all these flickering little dualities that come upon us in this world, then we become steady. Some years ago, my mother and father came to India to visit me. And outside of Bombay, I took them to a place called Elephanta. It's an island. It's about a 40-minute boat ride from the gateway of India on a ferry. Took my mother and father. It's the first time they were in India. And it was a culture shock for them, but they didn't know what was about to happen to them. So, they were just seeing poverty and colors and music and smells and flavors that they never experienced before. And they were actually, really trying to understand it all. And then we got off the boat and we started walking through this forest toward a cave where there's an ancient statue. And as we're walking through the forest, a monkey jumped out of a tree and stood right in front of my beloved mother, who was born and raised in Chicago. The first thing this monkey did is showed his teeth, the sharp ones. Next screeched, and looked at my mother with such wrath in his eyes, his green eyes. My mother was culture shocked. She went, ah! And within a second, that monkey jumped right at my mother and grabbed her purse. There was a tug of war between the monkey and my mother over this purse, and my mother was pulling, and the monkey just, as he was pulling, he wouldn't let go. He just looked at my mother and showed teeth again and was just about to jump right into her face, and she got all scared and let go of the purse, and the monkey ran off with the purse, ran about a half a block down, climbed to the top of a tree. Now, not only was it culture shock for a lady who was spent so many years in Chicago suburbs, but within her purse was my mother and father's passports, airline tickets, because in those days there wasn't email stuff tickets, all their credit cards, and all their money for their whole trip. Everything was in that purse. This was a major problem. And my mother was beside herself in grief, and she told my father, everything we have is in that purse, all our money, our passports, our tickets. What are we going to do? The monkey stole my purse. And they looked at me like, you're the one that invited us to this place. So, from my experience in India, I happened to see a little ways down, there was a person selling fruit just sitting on the ground with a little blanket and fruit on the blanket. And I ran over, and I didn't have any money, and my parents had no. The monkey had all the money. So I borrowed a banana, and I ran over to that tree, and the monkey was way up there, and he started looking inside the purse, and he was going to eat everything. I don't know what he was going to do. So I took the banana and I aimed really as good as I could, and I threw it toward the monkey. And the monkey saw that banana coming toward him, And in order to catch the banana, he dropped the purse. And I quickly grabbed that purse, and that monkey couldn't care less. He had his banana. He was peeling it and eating it and totally happy. And I brought the purse back to my mother, and she was really proud of me. I've never seen her so proud of me. When I came back to America months later, all my relatives and friends, and they were all talking, you saved your parents from the monkey. They're so proud of you. Anyways, my mother, the first thing she said was, pay the fruit vendor for the banana. I forgot all about that, but mothers are there to remind us. But I was meditating. The mind is like that monkey. The way to keep the mind from causing so much trouble in our life is to give the monkey of the mind something higher. Something that's really fulfilling and satisfying to it. Then it doesn't have to go and start having illicit relations, and it doesn't have to go and, be a victim of greed and arrogance and anger. If you have something higher that you experience, and that higher thing is within us. In the Bible, there's an explanation that you should build your house on solid rock, not on shifting sand. Because if you build it on shifting sand, a storm comes, it's going to fall. If you build it on solid rock, any storm comes, and it's going to stand. So what is our mental foundation? If we build our foundation on deep inner satisfaction, then the inevitable storms that come in our life cannot really disturb us. We deal with them with a clear mind. We deal with them with integrity and with character. With love. Otherwise, if the stability of our mind is based on the circumstances that are coming to us from outside, then the inevitable will happen, and our character and our integrity will be compromised. And our satisfaction in life will be compromised. So we're all looking for fulfillment. We're all looking for love. Yoga. And from this perspective, in the broader sense, yoga is, in Sanskrit, that which harmonizes, reconnects us with the divine within. That is the meaning of yoga. And interestingly, religion comes from the Latin word religio, which means to bind back. To reconnect us with the essence, with the love that is within us. And when we do that, we have a strong spiritual foundation that whatever may come in this world, we deal with it with integrity to make real positive change. Dean Elmore was talking about how much he loves stress. Now that was a unique perspective. But that's as far as I could see, Dean Elmore, you're a yogi. Because that's what yogis do. They love stress. Because they see the opportunity to grow in stress. Because it's there. If we manage stress properly by having a clear mind, then it helps us to grow. If we don't, it can cripple us. Common examples. An athlete. An athlete needs stress to grow. A weightlifter, there's resistance, right? He's lifting weights. If the weights aren't heavy enough, he's not going to become any stronger. But if he doesn't, if they're too heavy and he doesn't know how to lift them, then he can pull all his bones and muscles. But if a weightlifter knows how to do it, through the resistance of those weights, he's getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And a runner, when a runner is running, there is resistance, there is stress on the lungs. They're pumping and pumping and pumping. If he knows how to do it properly, he's going to become faster and gain endurance through that process. And a student, there's exams. Who likes exams? Now, some of you do. You yogi students, you like your exams. But I went to school at one time, and I didn't like exams. Most people don't, because there's stress. You have to cram, you have to study. There's a junction you have to face whether you're going to pass or fail, and it's dependent on how I do on this exam. Stress. But the reality is, if schools didn't have exams, what would really motivate us to go deeper and deeper into the subject? Exams are necessary because they're stressful. And that stress induces us to actually learn the subject better. Now, if we have a good mind, if our mind is in a healthy condition, we know how to manage that stress to grow. Because I know, both in the East and West, there's a lot of students who commit suicide because they can't cope with the stress of studies and exams. That means their foundation is very weak. That means their inner fulfillment and inner satisfaction is not very strong, and therefore the external conditions are affecting them so seriously. The Queen of Jewels, the diamond, is nothing but common coal that has, through the wisdom of nature, been transformed due to immense pressure. And gold is purified by putting it in blazing fire. It's true. When stressful conditions come to us, it's an opportunity to go deeper into our subject and also to take shelter seriously of a power beyond our own. From a spiritual perspective, stress, resistance, crises, disasters can actually impel a person. I can't do it. I'll do the best I can, but I need help. And in that situation, I remember a few years ago I was on an airplane from London to Bombay. I live in Bombay, Mumbai. And as we're flying through the sky, this British Airways, there was all this buzzers going off and alarms. And then they said, "We are having an emergency. We are going to have an emergency landing." And every 3 or 4 minutes, this alarm went off, and they kept telling us what we had to do. They took the biggest, strongest guys and moved their seats to near the exit doors. And then they told us, how you have to put your head down and put your legs up, and all these ways by which, you're not going to be less chances of being destroyed. And the airline hostesses were teaching everybody, and people were crying, and children were crying, and people were really getting scared. And the airline hostesses, they were as scared as the rest of us, but they had to tell us not to be scared. But hardly anyone could take them too serious. Anyways, when we finally were coming close to the tarmac, we saw from pretty high up about 25 ambulances, fire trucks with their lights blinking, lining the runway. So we realized this is actually a pretty serious subject happening here. Now, trying to be a spiritual person myself, I pray every day. So much I pray, and I chant God's names every day so much, and I meditate. But usually on airplanes, I'm kind of like that, But this flight, I wasn't. When I was hearing these buzzers, and I was looking down at those flashing lights, and I remember my meditation, my prayer, was not the slightest bit ritualistic. It was totally unsectarian. There was no ego involved. It was about, I need help. And there's nothing I can do about it. I can't fix what the control system of the airplane went out. What could I do? And I remember thinking, and actually this happened just a couple weeks after my friend Bhakti Tirtha Swami passed away. And I was right at his bedside, holding his hand as he asked me to do. When he passed away, there were hundreds of people all around him, praying, crying in love for him, chanting God's names. You were there, Gauravaniji? Wasn't it beautiful? So much love, so much prayer. And those prayers were going on for weeks before it happened, and it culminated at that moment. And I was there with him. And I was thinking, I'm going to go, I might go now, and nobody even knows. Nobody's praying for me. Nobody's chanting for me. I'm just on this plane. So when I was turning to God, this lasted about an hour, this emergency landing, the whole process. At a certain point, I can tell you honestly, no pride, I felt totally liberated and fearless. It just didn't matter anymore. Because I just had to go so deep, there was nowhere outside to turn to. I had to go to God within my heart, and I turned. And when I was chanting his names and praying, it was not any longer, save me. It's just everybody I knew, I was just praying to God to bless them and bless my students, bless my family, bless all humanity, bless all living beings. And I was just praying for blessings, and I became so blissful because I wasn't asking for anything for myself. I just was praying for God to bless. And it didn't matter what happened with the plane. And then I think what they told me we did is we landed on the ground at something like 700 miles an hour or something. But I don't remember exactly, but it was a huge... We landed so fast. It just and we were bouncing and bouncing and bouncing. We could, all the luggage up top, the things were breaking open and luggage was flying down, and babies were crying and people were screaming, and we could hear the luggage below going vroom, 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 vroom. And we saw all the fire trucks following us on both sides. And they had to stop, and there was smoke from the tires just pouring out. And finally we stopped. And it just smelled like smoke and burning rubber and fire, and all the trucks surrounded us, and they had their hoses. Then they announced we're not out of danger, because at any moment, they didn't say this, but we knew, at any moment, because of the heat of the landing, this plane could blow up. And they wouldn't let us come near the terminal. So we're all waiting. I was meditating. It was so nice. And then finally, about a half hour later, the plane starts to move. And the pilot says, "We are sorry for the inconvenience. But sometimes these things happen in the aviation technology." And he said, "But we are hoping that next time you fly, you choose British Airways." Now, I can tell you honestly, I'm not praying for that to happen again, believe me. But I can tell you, when I look back, I was more God conscious on that flight than any other time before in my life. And as far as flights, stress can help us to really go within and access a divine power beyond our own, wherein we can really be instruments of positive change. Not just superficial positive changes, but based on the deep foundation of love and compassion that we find within ourselves. And in yoga, the asanas, the breath control, the meditation, the chanting of mantras, ultimately it's all meant to bring us, to reconnect us to that spiritual essence that we have, and to perceive the sacredness of that spiritual essence in everyone. There's a beautiful verse, Trinarapi sunichena taror ibasi hishnuna. Amani namanadena kirtaniya sadahari. If one really wants to access the Lord through our hymns, our prayers, our chanting, our meditation, then we should be humble like a blade of grass, forgiving like a tree. We should offer all honor and respect to all living beings and not demand respect for oneself. In that state, which is our nature, what power can flow through us to create beautiful things within this world? You see, from the yogic or real spiritual perspective, we're seeing things with the understanding that I am, we all are, eternal, divine, parts of God. The soul within us is all beautiful, all loving, and nothing can destroy it. The body and the mind, it's going to be destroyed by nature's course anyway. But as long as we have it, it's a sacred tool. It's a sacred vehicle by which we could do wonderful things within this world. When we understand that we're eternal, and we understand the beauty of the love that is within us, then the things that bother us in this world really don't bother us anymore, because they're pretty insignificant. There's really nothing to fear. We can forgive ourselves. We can overcome our own depression and self-guilt because we understand the beauty inherent within us. And we can improve in doing so. And we can forgive others as well. Yes, life is beautiful. One great writer said, "Truth is beauty and beauty is truth." The only real reality is beauty. The beauty of the divinity of the soul, the beauty of divinity of God, the beauty within everything. What is all the ugliness? It's a product of ignorance. Why people's egos get in the way so much. So really to be an instrument of such divine change within this world, this yoga of psychology is such a gift. And I've tried to just speak a few words that I was inspired to speak by our beloved Yogi Dean. So grateful that you're here. I'm so grateful to all of you. Would anyone like to ask any questions? Yes.
How were you inspired at such a young age? I'm reading your book now. I'm on page 79, and I really like it. And I'm just amazed at how at such a young age you were inspired to. You have this spiritual yearning, and how you like traveled all across the world from Europe to India. And I mean, it's really hard for someone normal to take that step and to be so daring. How was it for you?
I guess I've always been abnormal. Well, the subject of the book is, I was born in 1950. And by the way, just to get back to where I led you before, I never wanted to write this book. Over a period of about 35 years, whenever I would tell a story about my travels in those days, the common reaction was, you should write a book. And my response was always the same, never. For two reasons. You know, I'm trying to give up this arrogance, and I was thinking, isn't it arrogant to write a whole book about me? I mean, some people could do it, it's all right, but I'm on a spiritual path trying to give up all this stuff. Every page is going to be filled with the words I, me, and mine. And the second reason was that I thought, if I tell the truth, nobody will believe me. Because so many incredible things happened on that journey. But when I was with Bhakti Tirtha Swami for that 8 weeks on his deathbed, one day, very close to the end, he looked up at me and said, "You should write a book about your travels when you were a young man." And I said, never. And I told him my reasons. And he looked up at me. He was laying in his bed. I was sitting at his bedside. He said, "This is not your story. This is the story of how God took a young man on an incredible journey to find the very same thing everyone is looking for, meaning and fulfillment. Your story could reach people's hearts beyond sectarian religion because it's a human story. If this story will bring hope and inspiration to people's hearts, then it is an act of arrogance for you not to write it. Do not be a miser." Then he took me by the hand and squeezed it. very affectionately. And he said, "Promise me on my deathbed that you will write and publish this book." No, he completely stole my heart by his gracious, divine company over these 8 weeks. I promised. And I wrote it. It's about a boy born in Chicago, brought up in a northern suburb, small town. It was a pretty normal kind of childhood. But then something happened. I became a teenager in the 1960s. And it was a turbulent time. When I was 15 years old, I had a job. And except for myself and one friend, everyone else was African Americans from the south side of Chicago. They were all my father's age. They were so beaten down by poverty, and they didn't have a chance. And I love them, and they love me. Why? Why do I get to live, a nice life, and they don't? Because of color. It just seemed like such a contradiction. The very basis of the greatness of America is freedom. And the Vietnam War was raging. And in those days, there was a draft. If you get drafted when you're 18, you either go to jail or you go to war. Or you escape the country and be a felon. Serious. I had many questions. I joined the civil rights movement. I expressed my concern about the war. I joined the counterculture. When I was 19, my friend Gary asked, "Come with me to Europe for a summer vacation." I said, "I have no money." He said, "I don't either. But Frank's going to pay for both of us." Frank was from Cherry Hill, New Jersey. So I said, "He's going to pay for both of us? Okay, I'll go." So we got a flight to Iceland. And because there were no volcanoes at that time, we got to go on a connecting flight to Luxembourg. And I remember the first day Frank got robbed. He didn't have all that much money, because the first night we were in Luxembourg, we all three crammed into this tiny little tent. That was what he could afford to pay. But then he got robbed, so we didn't even have a tent anymore. So he went back, and Gary and I, we were searching. And more, I was coming to the conclusion that the same kind of hypocrisy and shallowness that the counterculture was revolting against was really the same, just in a different package. I really wanted transformation. I heard Martin Luther King speak that if you don't have an ideal that you're willing to die for, you have nothing meaningful to live for. I was craving for that ideal. Mahatma Gandhi spoke. I read his words. Be the change you want to see in the world. Not just talk about it and revolt about it. Be it. And I came to my own conclusion. It was a calling in my heart that change had to be something spiritual. And it led me eventually to separate from Gary and hitchhike across Europe and across the Middle East. Don't try to do it today. I went through Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Took 6 months from London to the border of India. And many wonderful, and when I say wonderful, I mean traumatic, near-death, and beautiful relationships. All kinds of wonderful things happened to me. And I really began to learn that, how we process things. I'll tell one little story, then I'll end this question. What was your question again? How did I get the courage? I can't say that I have much courage, but there was a calling in my heart. And I just felt so deeply inspired to follow that calling. And if we have a divine purpose, courage is given to us even if we have none. It's important that we follow our ideals and our calling in life. Should I give another quote from Michelangelo? He said, "The greater danger is not to have high hopes and not reach them, but to have low hopes and reach them." Does that make sense? It's a greater danger. We should have high hopes. We should have an ideal we're willing to live and die for. And we should strive for that. And when it has a spiritual purpose behind it, then the courage and the empowerment comes beyond ourselves. I was always a scared little guy. When I was a little boy, if there was a spider in my bedroom, I would run and cry for my mother to remove it because I was afraid to be in the same room with a spider. And my mother used to always say, "He's so scared." And I remember one time, my name was Richard. And one time when my parents introduced me to a rabbi, they said my name was Richard. And he said, "Oh, Richard the Lion-Hearted?" And my mother said, "Not at all." So I wasn't courageous. So many things I wanted to do, I was afraid to do. But if I wanted something strong enough, the courage came. And I remember when I was living in the Himalayas, I was living in one cave. You'll get to this in the book. And it was just a little cave. You want to hear this story? Okay. And it was just a little cave, and I didn't have a sleeping bag. There was no beds in caves. There's no doors. I was just sleeping on a stone, dirt-covered cave floor. And it was night, and I was laying down. And I was going to go to sleep. And then crawling about 4 inches from my face was the biggest, hairiest, scariest spider I ever saw in my life. And he was like lifting his legs like this. Crawling. And he was just about here like this. And there was a little hole about this deep that he was going to go into, this far from my face. And it just brought back the memories of me running to my mother telling her to remove. And the spiders that I was afraid of when I was a little boy, they were about this big. And this one was about this big. And I was kind of looking at him, because I had a little candle burning. I was looking at him, and I saw his jaws going. I was thinking, God, he could really bite if he wants to. And maybe he's poison, I don't know. And I remember thinking, should I leave the cave and find another one? Should I kill it? Pick up a rock and smash it to death? Or maybe this is God's way of helping me to overcome that fear of spiders. It was a crash course. Now, how to do it? It really works, a change of perception. It's not just theoretical. I prayed, help me grow through this experience. And I realized he's a spirit soul just like I am. I'm looking for happiness in this cave, and he's looking for happiness in this cave too. What makes me better than a spider? He's my roommate. And so I just decided, the candle's going to go out, and I put the candle out, and I just went to sleep with the spider sleeping this far away from my face. And I didn't fall asleep immediately. But I was meditating. The fear was there. But because I took shelter of a higher purpose, that fear actually catapulted my consciousness into something higher than it would have ever been if it wasn't there. So again, what Dean Elmore was telling us, that stressful conditions can be like a launching pad to bring us higher if we just process it with the right attitude. If we're looking for something higher, we'll find it. But we can't give up. That's failure. What Thomas Edison, he was asked, don't you get discouraged when your experiments fail? He said, they're not. He said, 1,000 experiments fail. I don't consider them failure. I have learned one extra way of how it doesn't work. That means I'm that much closer to discovering how much it works. Failure is not that we don't achieve what we're looking for. Failure is we give up. We give up hope. We give up enthusiasm. Because with a spiritual dimension in life, it's all about our purpose. It's all about our ideal. It is said that God doesn't see what you do, he sees the intention. And Bhagavad Gita explains, don't worry about success or failure, or victory or defeat. Just do your dharma with faith, enthusiasm, and love. And that in and of itself is the ultimate victory. So yes, courage and all these other virtues are given by the power of grace if we just sincerely have a good ideal and don't give up. That's kind of the story of the journey home. Does that answer your question? Is there any other question? Yes. We'll do her first.
I want to say thank you so much. You have no idea how deep that is.
You don't know how deeply I'm touched by what you just said. Thank you.
I mean, I don't have any religion, but I really believe in something very deeply. I believe in that, like, human being or I have deeply connection with the natural world and the whole universe. It's like, I believe in pure motivation. If you just want to do it and it's not for, like, outside thing, just because you want it and pay for it, work hard on it. That's my belief. So do you think, I mean, is that kind of thing, or, I don't know, it kind of bothers me because I don't have religion, so sometimes I question myself for being like not faithful or things like that.
You're a beautiful person, and you're trying to do good, and that's beautiful. But at the same time, you know, we believe that there is something very divine and something eternal that is the source of that will to be good that is within us. And to tap into that, we can just do so much more good for the world. Thank you. And you had a question. Is there any time we should end? Because what time is it? Okay, whoever's organizing, what shall I do? Shall I end or keep going or?
I think maybe we'd like to, maybe proceed with the Yeah, if you could be patient with us, bear with us for just one moment.
Sure, definitely.
Thank you so much for the wonderful time. My chanting friends.
So we'll do chanting now. Okay, thank you so much. I want to thank all of you so much for being such a kind audience. And Dean Elmore, thank you so much for spending all this time with us. And for your beautiful lesson. And thank you. What is the name of your club again?
Boston University Holistic Yoga Club.
My sincerest gratitude to the Boston University Holistic Yoga Club. Thank you very much. Would you like to chant, Gaurvani ji? I'll chant a little and then you chant, because Gaurvani, can I tell you something about Gaurvani? He's heard this many times. His mother is from the same village that I grew up in. She's the only other person in the world that's following my tradition that's from that same village. And a few years ago, he came to India, and there was a festival. How many people were there that year? There was about between 3,000 and 4,000 people for a 4-day festival, and he was singing these beautiful kirtans, beautiful chanting, and he mesmerized everyone. He was chanting for hours and hours, and people were meditating, and people were dancing, and people were weeping. They were just so happy. And at the end of the festival, there was just, the organizers were thanking people, and I was thanking everyone. And I asked if anyone wanted to say anything. And Gaurvani stood up in front of almost 4,000 people. And he talked about how he was born in this bhakti yoga culture. But at a certain point in his teenage years, he went astray. But he said his mother prayed for him. And he became very emotional. And he said, whatever I've done for you, it is on the strength of my mother's prayers. And he looked out into the audience and said, never, ever take, what was your words exactly? He said, never underestimate a mother's prayers. And he had 8,000 eyes with tears in them. And they clapped. This is Gauranga. And this is a very, very great spiritual attribute. Because the ego, we want to take credit for what we do materially, and we can even fall in that trap in spiritual life. I'm a great yogi, or I'm a great devotee. And we can become arrogant about being spiritual. But real spirituality, it's a universal principle. The meek shall inherit the earth. Our greatness, when we don't see it as ours, but we see it the grace of God and the grace of other people, then our greatness, then we can actually be instruments of that grace, when the ego's not in the way. So yes, he's one of the most tremendous musicians and one of the most devotional singers, but he takes no credit. He gives all credit to everyone else. And he loves to do that. And that is it's a spiritual virtue that we can actually find thousands of times more fulfillment giving credit to someone else than taking it ourselves. And when I told his mother about this, she became quite emotional. And she said, no, it has nothing to do with me, it's him. It's a family of saints. So now we'll have some chanting.